Good morning, I'm Joe Fryer. Day 2 of what has been dubbed Operation Epic Fury is well underway. The U.S.-Israeli strikes on Iran continue this morning as Iran retaliates, firing at U.S. military assets and other targets throughout the Middle East. In the first wave of strikes yesterday, Iran's longtime supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was killed on the streets of Tehran. There is both celebration and mourning following the Ayatollah's death. And now, more than anything, there are questions about what happens next. This morning, temporary leaders have been appointed in Iran. We're also learning of the first U.S. casualties, with U.S. Central Command saying 3 U.S. service members have been killed and 5 seriously wounded as part of this Operation Epic Fury. We have correspondents around the globe, but let's get the very latest from NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, in Tel Aviv. Richard, good morning.
This is one of the areas that was hit by an Iranian ballistic missile, and this country is now bracing for more attacks as Iran is promising revenge. After the death of Iran's supreme leader, the country has appointed a 3-member interim council until a new supreme leader can be elected.
The government in Iran is under attack like never before, with the United States and Israel systematically targeting Iran's leaders and military sites with hundreds of strikes so far. But the Iranian government still has many supporters. Tens of thousands of them packed into Tehran's Revolution Square this morning to mourn the late supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, killed in a joint U.S. and Israeli military operation. They chanted, "God is great," while Iranian officials are promising revenge, one saying Iran would deliver terrifying blows to make the U.S. and Israel beg for mercy. But others in Iran seem to welcome the U.S. and Israeli strikes. As soon as the news broke last night that the Ayatollah was dead, young people in a city outside Tehran went out to dance in the streets. And even in Tehran, where the government is hunting down the opposition, some Iranians shouted from their rooftops, "Long live the Shah," a reference to Iran's former king, overthrown nearly a half a century ago. But for now, the Iranian government remains firmly in control and is lashing out in what it calls self-defense, launching attacks on U.S. bases and American allies in the Gulf, using drones to attack a building in Bahrain, where the U.S. has a naval base, hotels in Dubai, the airport in Kuwait, and a U.S. base in Qatar, where a piece of a shot-down missile fell onto the street. But Iran's main focus so far appears to be Israel, which Iran sees as the driving force behind this war. Tel Aviv is being attacked in waves.
You can see the Israeli missile defense system now in action. We're in the midst of the most intense barrage that we've seen in this city since this operation began.
But at least one Iranian missile got through Israel's missile defense shield. A woman was killed. Civilians are dying in Iran, too. A girls' school was hit in southern Iran. Iranian state media report around 100 were killed, many of them students.
The U.S. military says it's looking into the incident. Israel's defense ministry says that the Israeli Air Force has now achieved air superiority over Iran and that Israeli aircraft can now stay, they can linger over Tehran and carry out attacks at will. Iran says it will retaliate. Iran is promising a massive revenge campaign, and one Iranian official told NBC News that potentially diplomatic facilities, consulates, and embassies in the region could be targeted.
All right, Richard, thank you. Let's get right to senior national security correspondent Courtney Kuby. Courtney, what more can you tell us about this breaking news right now? The U.S. service members who were killed, what are we learning? Do we know anything about how it happened?
Yeah, so far we know, according to U.S. Central Command, that's the military command in the Middle East, we know that at least 3 U.S. service members have been killed as part of this Operation Epic Fury. That's the airstrikes, this continuing campaign against Iran, and at least 5 others have been seriously wounded. Now, we know that others have sustained other injuries. The CENTCOM described them as shrapnel injuries and concussions as part of this. We're still trying to find out exactly where this occurred, if it was one location. what may sound familiar here, guys, is the idea of shrapnel injuries and concussions. You'll recall that when Iran struck at Al-Udeid, or excuse me, at Al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq several years ago after the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani, there were a number of service members, dozens, in fact, who received concussions and traumatic brain injuries because of the concussive blast of the ballistic missiles that Iran launched at that base. So despite the fact that the individuals were able to get into shelters in most cases, get away from the blast, just the sheer magnitude of the ballistic missiles hitting caused some of those injuries. So it's not clear at this point whether that was what happened here or not, but that could be why CENTCOM is now reporting a number of concussions. Again, we're now reporting that at least 3 U.S. troops have been killed in Operation Epic Fury. At least 5 others have sustained serious injuries. And I have to say, this is an ongoing campaign against Iran by the United States, and Iran continues to retaliate. So this is a number that we will continue to watch, but it will likely change in the coming hours and days, guys.
Courtney, we know you'll update us the moment you get more information, but picking up where you left off, we know the U.S. military had been building up its presence in the region for several weeks. I mean, just walk us through now. We're on day 2 of this, past the initial strikes on day 1. What is the U.S. military involvement right now? Do we have an idea of just how long this operation could last for American forces?
We should be thinking about this not in terms of days, but in terms of weeks at this point, if in fact the military is expected to achieve these goals laid out by President Trump in the only time we have heard from him since this campaign began. That was a social media video that the White House posted at about 2:30 in the morning, early Saturday morning, explaining the goals that he wants for this operation. And that is the destruction of Iran's nuclear program, the destruction of their ballistic missile program, as he put it, the annihilation of their Navy. And then, of course, this ultimate goal, which is to overthrow or topple the Iranian regime there, which the President Trump called on the people there to play a big part in. If, in fact, the U.S. military is expected to be used for those goals, this is not a short campaign. We have already seen, as you mentioned, Joe, the U.S. military bring in the largest amount of firepower, a concentrated amount of firepower in the region in a generation. They have already unleashed hundreds of strikes against Iran in just the first 20 or 32 hours or so since this began. As I mentioned, it is a sustained air campaign, and it's not just airstrikes. They are also striking from land and striking from the sea. But it's also not just about the offensive posture here. You know, I just mentioned these service members who were killed. Iran is also retaliating. They are lashing out at countries all throughout the region, trying to hit Americans, trying to hit hit the Israelis, and the U.S. is involved in the defense of that, not just the defense of U.S. bases, but the defense of allies. And as part of that, this massive amount of U.S. military who've moved into the region in recent weeks, they are also responsible for the defensive posture that, again, as Iran continues to lash out after the U.S. and Israel began these strikes early Saturday morning, the defensive piece of this will be just as important as the offensive piece, Joe.
You're touching on it here, but just help us understand the U.S. presence in the region, because even before we saw this buildup over the last few weeks, we have several bases around the Gulf, and then we have this increased presence that we've seen in recent weeks. What does it look like? How deeply is America involved here?
Extremely deeply. I mean, the U.S. is completely entangled in this in Iran right now. And look, again, President Trump laid out these aspirational goals for Iran, and it appears that the U.S. military is the main focus here, as opposed to the diplomatic efforts that, as of Thursday of last week, seemed as if they were continuing to move forward, especially when you consider what the administration was telling us after those meetings. They kept describing them as positive. Now, that may have just been some diplomatic speak here, because it's now very clear, according to a senior Trump administration official, that they walked out of those meetings and they were very clear that the Iranian side, as they said, were not interested in really dealing. They were just interested in stalling. So now the decision came out of that meeting, after that meeting, by President Trump to pursue the military piece of this. That's what we're seeing here. I mean, you can see they have just unleashed a torrent of airstrikes against Iran in the last day and a half or so, and we do not expect this to end anytime soon. We've also seen, again, Iran lash back out, resulting in attacks that have injured and killed civilians all throughout the region. So the real question now, Joe, is when does this end? How does this end? And as President Trump put it himself, he acknowledged that there would be casualties here. We're starting to see that unfold.
Yeah, that's right. CENTCOM reporting 3 service members killed, 5 seriously wounded. That breaking news this hour. Courtney Cubie, we know as soon as you learn more, you will cut in and give us any updates. Let's turn now to NBC's Monica Alba, who is at the White House. Monica, Courtney mentioned really the only time, at least on camera, we've heard from the president was that video posted to Truth Social more than 24 hours ago. He has posted a little bit on social media since then. What is it we're hearing from the president and his administration? Is there any chance that he's going to address the nation anytime soon?
Well, it's possible, Joe, that we will hear from him later today as he's expected to travel back from Florida to the White House at some point. As you know, the president, when he is traveling on Air Force One and with reporters, will often take questions in the moment. But as far as a larger speech or a primetime address to the nation, there are no indications right now that that is going to happen. That could also change. That could certainly be something that is being discussed as there is mounting pressure on the White House and on President Trump to really make the case to the American people for explaining his rationale, why he decided to ultimately do this, what the main objective is, and what you were just discussing with Courtney. What is the end game? How does this end up resulting in any kind of conclusion where the U.S. then decides they can walk away from this initial military action that they started and that they did in conjunction with Israel yesterday? And we just don't simply know the answer to that, but we have a little bit of a window into the president's thinking and what he posted just overnight. He issued another warning to Iran saying that they should not continue to retaliate. Otherwise, they will be met with the force like they have never seen, in the words of President Trump. And again, just to reiterate, Joe, how unusual it is for this president to be communicating in this way and to be operating down from Florida, not here from the White House, even though that is something he has been doing for other key military action decision points in his presidency so far in this second term. You see there he has sort of a makeshift situation room where you had Vice President Vance back here in the actual situation room at the White House monitoring as all of this has been unfolding this weekend. We do know the president is continuing to be briefed by his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who is down there with him. And we should also point out, Joe, that the president last night, we were told by the White House, attended a fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago where he was scheduled to be. He did end up going to that. We understand there weren't any on-camera remarks that we were able to see. But then again, today, as he does travel back, we will expect to see him and see what other information he shares. I think it is important to point out what you guys touched on when you were discussing this tragic news of the U.S. service members who have been killed and those who have been gravely wounded, that the president did acknowledge that he believed that starting this kind of military action would likely result in the loss of American lives. That is something that he said happens when you start a, quote, war. It was his use of the word war there when he did acknowledge that this was a likely possibility. And as you have been indicating, one that could continue, could change, and could bring more loss of U.S. service members. Joe.
Let's talk, Monica, about the political reaction to these strikes so far. I mean, we know many Republicans are speaking out in support. We heard this morning from Senator Lindsey Graham speaking on Meet the Press with our Kristen Welker, calling this, saying the mothership of terrorism is sinking. But some Democrats raising questions about the president once again using the military without congressional approval, also asking these same questions about what is the end game here. What are we hearing from both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, there have been really persistent calls for more information about what the strategy is here, what the thinking is. And we've gotten a little bit of insight into that from the president himself over the last couple of weeks, who did indicate that he thought regime change would be, quote, best in Iran. But we haven't gotten any kind of follow-up information. Our own Kristen Welker, moderator of Meet the Press, asked the president in a phone call yesterday, OK, well, if the current leadership is gone, who should take over? What should happen next? Who should be ruling Iran? And the president hasn't gotten into those kinds of details. So that is certainly a major open question here. And when you talk about the role that Congress can play, you have seen lawmakers seeking more information. Administration officials are set to brief lawmakers at some point in the coming days. We do know that Secretary Rubio was able to give the Gang of Eight a heads up before these strikes started. He reached 7 of the 8 members. He had briefed them in depth for about an hour, the day of the State of the Union about this possible action. And again, we know that there have been communications behind the scenes, but lawmakers are being urged to return to Washington to potentially face a vote on authorizing this kind of military action. But as we've seen, Joe, over the last couple of months, this president has decided to take these kinds of decisions and to really pursue military action without getting congressional approval first. And so we'll see, as that is a big storyline that will play out here in D.C. in the coming days as they return to Washington.
Yeah, and it's raising a lot of questions because we know during the 2024 campaign, the president vowed to end wars as he pushed for his America First agenda. We've seen this year the operation in Venezuela, taking Nicolas Maduro into custody. That was quick, but this one in Iran, as you mentioned, could go on for weeks, as the president says. Is the president facing any resistance from his own base right now?
Yeah, and I mean, that is a huge question, and we've seen some kind of cracks emerge, mostly from Republicans and those in the MAGA base who have been critical of President Trump. I'm thinking of people like former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, who her major disagreement with the president was this notion that he wasn't pursuing an America First agenda that he campaigned on in 2024 in the fashion that she wanted to see. She felt like he was spending too much time concerned with foreign entanglements and issues overseas where he wanted to get the U.S. involved. Obviously, she has left Congress, and they left on a pretty acrimonious note, and that has been clear from some other Republicans who have, again, been critics of President Trump who've raised questions about this. So far, you have seen mostly Republicans and allies of the president praising his move to remove the Ayatollah, to remove the supreme leader. But there are certainly going to be questions from these members who are probably going to be hearing about this in their districts. And as we look to the midterm elections, these kinds of questions always linger and loom in the background. But the question of whether foreign policy decisions might sometimes matter as much to Americans as decisions that are more domestic, like the economy and affordability, that is always a little bit a part of the conversation here. But I think you can expect most in the GOP to praise the president's initial decision here. But in terms of how long this is going to go, how protracted it's going to be, that will change. And something that really stood out to me, Joe, is that in the last couple of days, Vice President Vance gave a newspaper interview where he laid down a marker and predicted that there would be, quote, no chance that the U.S. could be drawn into a years-long conflict in the Middle East if the president decided to pursue these strikes. That interview took place before Friday night and Saturday early hour strikes. But that is what he said, whereas the president is taking a different tone and saying that when you do something like this, there's always the risk that the U.S. could be a part of this for a very, very long time, that is something that is certainly in his mind, certainly contributed to his thinking, and certainly something that this White House was aware of before making this huge decision.
Monica Alba at the White House, where the president is expected to return later today. Monica, thank you so much. NBC's chief international correspondent Keir Simmons joins me now from Dubai. Keir, first of all, I know you have been a witness to explosions in the skies over the United Arab Emirates with missiles and drones intercepted by the UAE, not just there in Dubai, also Abu Dhabi. First, tell us what it is you're seeing there.
Yeah, just about while we were listening to Monica, I was listening to a fighter jet overhead here in Dubai. The airspace is closed, so any aircraft that you hear up there are there to try to shoot down the large numbers of drones and missiles that have been fired on Abu Dhabi and Dubai, where I am here. We have heard explosion after explosion this morning, two large blasts, one even louder than the other, that vibrated. There is an air base about 20 miles south of Dubai, about 20 miles from here. It looks like that may have been the target, but it hasn't just been bases that have been targeted. Hotels have been hit. The airport not far from here has been hit. It, of course, is closed. So is Abu Dhabi Airport, also closed. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates authorities, Joe, are talking about the tally so far, 167 missiles fired at the UAE, more than 500 drones. Just to reassure you, and I've been saying this through last night and today, Joe, I'm outside, but I am right by my home. I'm underneath cover here. So one of the risks is that when missiles or drones are intercepted, and most of them are being intercepted, then the debris that falls, you can be in the wrong place at the wrong time. You don't want that. As you can imagine, too, my kids are staying inside. School is cancelled. But this is a barrage across this region, across the Gulf. As you mentioned, the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, here in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, no country in the Arab world in this region has been spared.
And Keir, to emphasize what you said, it's not just U.S. military bases that Iran is attempting to strike. Is it surprising to see Iran launching strikes on places like the UAE, Bahrain, and other places, even expanding now to Oman, which has been trying to mediate a solution between the U.S. and Iran? Oman even criticizing the U.S. yesterday. Is there the potential for Iran that this could backfire?
Yeah, leaders are stunned by that. Leaders in this region are stunned by the onslaught that they are suffering. What Iran appears to be trying to do, if there is any, frankly, method to it, because I think to some extent this is desperation on Tehran's part. Well, and we also, just to make the point, with the death of Ayatollah Khamenei, we don't actually know whose finger is on the trigger. But still, what they do appear to be doing is to try to get this part of the region to go to Washington and say, we can't stand this, please stop. Now, that isn't working so far. Actually, what's happening is it's uniting these countries, and they are furious. Honestly, Oman is the latest example. As you mentioned, they were mediators just last week, and yet now their port has been hit. There are a number of deaths across the region already and injuries, despite the fact that so much of this has been intercepted. So that, frankly, is backfiring on the Iranians, and it does seem as if this is a kind of a last-ditch strategy to just use what the Israelis estimate at the beginning of this was 2,500 ballistic missiles. There are hundreds being fired, and the Israelis and the Americans are also taking out some of those rocket launchers. So you have to wonder how many are going to be left within days, what Iran is going to be left with, except for the remnants of a disastrous, even among war, diplomatic policy that is turning many of the countries in this region that were, kind of semi-friends with Iran against them. That being said, Iran is inflicting damage, and this is a war, and we're only at the beginning of it. So this can escalate. This can get worse. There can be moments that turn opinion. All of those things are possible in the days ahead.
Keir, talk to us about the port of Hormuz and what is happening right there and the impact that's going to have not just on the region, but all around the world.
Yeah, Hormuz is closed. Now, that's the strait, a very narrow piece of sea that is not just about Iranian oil and gas. It's the oil and gas from this region. It is the conduit for 20% of oil and gas for the world economy. So there is no question that the oil price will go up, may even surge. Of course, as we know, that does, even in this era when oil is less important, it does have an impact on the world economy. And the question is, and we've seen it in the Red Sea over recent years, the question is, how do you get that working again? Because we know very well commercial shipping insurance does not like those ships sailing into areas that are at risk. The Iranians don't necessarily need to close it, although they say they have closed it. It can just be too dangerous. Already, according to the Yemenis, the Houthis, that ragtag group in Yemen, are retargeting the Red Sea again. So you now have two crucial pieces of economic lifeline on the sea that are at risk, and that will have an impact. That must have an impact if this continues over time. And to make another point, Joe, and I think it's an important one, just think about the fact that the Houthis were able to do that in the Red Sea, and they are no elite group. Iran can be collapsing and leaderless and struggling, and yet still able to close a place like the Strait of Hormuz or threaten it to make it effectively closed.
Keir Simmons, please continue to stay safe. We appreciate your reporting from Dubai. Thank you so much. And we will be right back with much more of our coverage in just a few minutes. We're back with continuing coverage of the strikes on Iran. This morning, Iran is retaliating and announcing temporary leadership for the country after the death of Ayatollah Khamenei. Let's bring in retired Colonel Steve Warren. He's an NBC News military analyst. Colonel, good to have you with us. We have a couple breaking news items happening just in the last few minutes. We're hearing reports the U.S. military saying it actually sunk an Iranian warship in the Gulf of Oman. And then you probably heard, as we were talking about at the top of the hour, the U.S. military saying that 3 service members have been killed, 5 others seriously wounded in this operation. We don't know the details of where that happened, if it all happened in one location. But this is just a reminder of how intensely the U.S. is involved in this operation, correct?
That's right, Joe. We are very intensely involved, and in the last 24 hours, we've seen both positive and negative. The United States Central Command announced just about 30 minutes ago that they have, in fact, sunk the first Iranian Navy ship. Now, if you recall yesterday, President Trump announced the destruction of the Iranian Navy as one of his objectives, or one of America's objectives in this operation. So first ship apparently has been now sunk. It's a Jamarin class frigate. So at the same time, within the last 60 minutes, we received the tragic news also from CENTCOM that American soldiers were killed, several others injured by shrapnel and have received concussions. This as a result of some type of Iranian action, although we don't have any additional details.
The president has made it clear this could last weeks. It's not just going to last days. What can we expect the U.S. involvement in this operation to look like over those weeks?
So what we've seen now, we're about 24, maybe 36 hours into this operation. So in the military, we use a phrase called battle rhythm. So now these forces are beginning to enter into a battle rhythm. In other words, they sort of are now beginning to understand what's coming next. This is American forces. So there'll be a regular schedule of attacks, battle damage assessment, and reattacks. So we have objectives laid out: destroy the Iranian Navy, destroy the Iranians' missile launch capability, and destroy the Iranian missile production capability. So this is the target set that the military's been given. We're now looking at those targets, and then we'll continue to attack, assess the damage, and then determine whether or not a reattack is required. So this pressure now will look fairly straightforward, fairly even pressure extended throughout until, frankly, all of the objectives are met. First objective, of course, was the destruction of the Iranian leadership. That's been met, although now presumably they'll reconstitute and another decision will have to be made.
Let's talk about that operation yesterday, taking out the Ayatollah and other members of the leadership. What sort of planning does it take to carry out an operation of that scale and successfully accomplishing the goal there, which was to take out the Ayatollah?
Well, it was an extraordinary mission, an extraordinary intelligence success, as well as a tactical success, the pilots and offensive operators who conducted it. Really what this is a result of months and months and months of observation, of intelligence collection, of pattern determination. In other words, our intelligence services look for patterns. How do these leaders live their lives? What days do they have their meetings? Where are their kids? All these things, how do they live their lives? And once that pattern's been established, we're then able to begin predicting where someone will be in the future. And I believe that's what happened here. I think the American and Israeli intelligence services have spent months determining the patterns that these leaders live by. And when they found out, or when they determined that several of these leaders would be together in a meeting at a certain location that was accessible, they decided to strike. On the tactical side, the Israeli forces who apparently carried out the actual strikes seem to have been extraordinarily successful.
Realistically, how long could this go? I mean, from a military standpoint for America, What could success look like?
Well, we are able to sustain, in other words, keep up these operations, frankly, indefinitely. We can continue our defense production. We'll continue to flow munitions and continue to flow logistics into the region. One of the great strengths of the American military is its ability to project and sustain power great distances. That is some of America's sort of magic formula that we've had really since World War II. So we'll be able to sustain this, I think, frankly, as long as necessary. Now, there's a political piece of all of this. You know, there are other considerations, but our ability to continue doing this, frankly, is almost unconstrained. Now, I believe we will probably achieve most of the objectives within 30, perhaps 60 days.
Colonel Steve Warren, appreciate your expertise. Thanks so much for joining us. And we will be right back with much more coverage in just a few minutes. We're back with more of our coverage of the strikes in Iran. Iranian state media has confirmed the country's longtime supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has killed in the joint attack by the U.S. and Israel early Saturday morning. In the initial aftermath of the strikes, Iran lashed out, launching attacks on U.S. bases and allies in the Gulf and striking civilian targets across the Middle East. We learned just a short time ago 3 U.S. service members were killed, at least 5 others seriously wounded as part of Operation Epic Fury. Overnight, Israel conducted new strikes into Iran. Let's bring in NBC's international correspondent Matt Bradley. He is in Israel, about an hour outside of Tel Aviv. Matt, tell us what's happening right now in Israel. I know there have been reports of some people who were killed near Jerusalem after a building was hit, then collapsed. What all are you seeing and hearing?
Yeah, Joe, you're finding me right now at the scene of what is so far the deadliest single strike in Israel by the Iranians, those Iranian counterattacks that have been going on ever since Israel first fired on the Iranians yesterday morning. So look at what's going on behind me here. You can see destroyed cars, some of these buildings completely leveled, and all of this torn up rebar and concrete that's been shattered. This was a direct hit. And as I said, 9 people have been killed, nearly 30 were injured, the single deadliest strike so far, and really puncturing a lot of Israelis' beliefs that they were, kind of had endured already the worst. Now, despite the fact that this is the most deadly strike so far, the thing that's going to be really upsetting to a lot of Israelis and frightening is that most of those casualties were sheltering inside a bomb shelter called a mamad in Hebrew. This is where so many Israelis have been fleeing when they hear these sirens that have been going on relentlessly all day yesterday, all night, and all day today. These mamads are able to endure the concussive blast of one of these ballistic missiles if it manages to evade Israel's formidable anti-air defense. But once it strikes, these safe rooms, they're not really able to endure a direct hit. So that's why we saw so many casualties here. The police say they're investigating as to whether or not this particular mamad or bunker was safe, or whether or not it was somehow faulty. But until they do, this is going to be very disturbing for a lot of Israelis who until now endured relatively few casualties. Joe?
And Matt, I know we saw you inside one of those shelters during our coverage yesterday. Just overall, what is the mood across Israel right now?
Hard to say. The situation here, Joe, is that a lot of Israelis are pretty happy with what happened. Khamenei killed. This was the public enemy #1 of the Jewish state, and not just ever since October 7th, but really for generations. And his predecessor, Khomeini, was seen the same way. So this is something that the Israelis can declare victory over, and certainly something that a lot of politicians are crowing about. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who decided to involve himself in this, what many people are calling a war of choice, is likely going to feel vindicated at the death of the top leader of Iran. But incidents like this one, where we're seeing so much death, is going to be calling into question for some Israelis whether or not this was worth it. But we haven't seen any opinion polls. We haven't seen exactly how people are feeling. But I've lived here for about a year, and I can tell you I'm pretty sure a lot of people are going to say that this mission, despite the casualties, has been a success.
All right, Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv. Matt, thank you so much for your reporting. There are growing security fears here at home about the strikes and Iran's retaliation. NBC's Valerie Castro joins me now with more on that part of the story. Valerie, good morning.
Joe, good morning. Law enforcement agencies across the country and at the federal level are on high alert for any kind of retaliation here on U.S. soil. There are currently no known threats, but that could change at any moment. Protests across the U.S. against strikes in Iran as law enforcement is on alert, working with intelligence agencies to thwart any potential threats to the United States and stepping up patrols at sensitive areas like houses of worship and diplomatic sites.
I think we should absolutely be worried about retaliation.
New York City police coordinating across agencies out of an abundance of caution, adding a visible presence outside the Israeli consulate and Iranian mission to the UN. 3 senior law enforcement officials say there are no plots or specific threats that U.S. counterterrorism officials are tracking, but they caution the situation could change.
These guys are going to want to strike back. Who's the most vulnerable? Domestically, it's usually our biggest cities, New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Chicago. They want to strike where there's impact.
In recent years, the FBI and NYPD's Joint Terrorism Task Force have stopped multiple Iran-backed plots. 3 men were convicted in a plot to kill an Iranian journalist in New York. Others charged in plots to assassinate former Ambassador John Bolton and then candidate Donald Trump, after the U.S. killed the commander of the Iranian military's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in a strike in 2020. And Joe, this raises questions about the possibility of any cyber attacks, though officials say Iran's near total internet blackout limits those concerns, but counterterrorism officials will likely be monitoring online chatter for any potential threats there as well. Joe.
Right. Valerie Castro reporting from Times Square. Valerie, thank you so much. As we head to break right now, we are going to be back with the latest from the region. And we want to show you a picture coming out of Paris right now of people there showing their support for the people of Iran. We'll be right back. We're back with much more of our coverage of the strikes in Iran, what's being called Operation Epic Fury by the United States. Let's bring in Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Aaron, good to have you with us. So I'm thinking just days ago, 5 days ago, President Trump delivered his State of the Union. Didn't really talk about Iran till late in the speech. That part lasted maybe about 3 minutes, and he didn't go into much detail. I know you've made the point typically, or others have made the point, I should say, that a president would typically make their case to the American people, lay out an argument for military action like this. In your mind, is this mission here defined at all? Do we know the end game?
No, we don't. And that is largely because ultimately the operation is going to be evaluated and judged within the context of what kind of regime emerges. And it seems to me, at least for the moment, that we can't underestimate the resiliency, the brutality, the instincts for survival of the current senior level officials who are running the country. And let's be very clear. If you want to seize power in Iran, you need guns, you need money, and you need legitimacy. And right now, the remnants of the IRGC and the malacracy, and whoever emerges as the successor to Ali Khamenei, they don't have legitimacy, but they have power, and they have the capacity, it seems to me, to continue to repress popular demonstrations. So we're not talking about a day after. We're not talking about a week after. We're probably not even talking for sure about a month after. It'll take quite a while to answer the question of whether or not eliminating Ali Khamenei and the military operations that the administration and the Israelis have conducted will provide a better outcome, a more stable Iran, or one that's going to be just as difficult to deal with.
We've heard the president and fellow Republicans say it's up to the Iranian people to take control of the government, to pick the next leader. What would it take to get to that point, to make that realistic?
Look, you need a fracturing of the security elite. You need a situation in which, for whatever reason, elements within the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps or the military decide that the current leadership is headed in the wrong direction. And you need a break in those security services so that if you had hundreds of thousands of Iranians out in the streets, the Basiji, the military, would refuse to fire on the demonstrators. That was the case in 2011 when Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was forced from power. That was the case in Tunisia when Ben Ali was forced from power. But until that happens, it's going to be extremely difficult to organize an effective opposition to challenge the current crowd that controls the instruments of state repression.
In the meantime, we've seen Iran fire at other countries in the Gulf region like the UAE, like Oman. Are you surprised by that, how they've approached that? I mean, what impact could that have on this part of the world? I
mean, I think in the past, the Iranian retaliation in April and October of 2024, when you had an Israeli-Iranian confrontation, and in the June 12-day war, the Iranians confined their responses to Israel and to a telegraphed response against Qatar in the Gulf. I think the Iranians had no choice but to demonstrate that, in effect, they do have retaliatory power. The Straits of Hormuz, through which a fifth of the world's known petroleum reserves transit, is effectively closed. We'll see what happens when the oil markets open up tonight. You've had 3 American casualties dead, 5 seriously wounded. I think the Iranians' major goal is regime preservation. I don't think they want a large and sustained confrontation with the United States.
All right. Aaron David Miller, we appreciate your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us on this Sunday. We appreciate it. We're going to be right back with much more of our ongoing coverage of the strikes in Iran in just a moment. We're back on a Sunday morning with more of our continuing coverage of the U.S.-Israeli strikes in Iran. This weekend's airstrikes mark the latest chapter in decades of hostilities between the United States and Iran. NBC's Raf Sanchez has a closer look.
For more than 70 years, the U.S. relationship with Iran has been complex and often hostile. In 1953, the CIA helped engineer a coup, which toppled Iran's democratically elected prime minister and put power firmly in the hands of its monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who opened his country to American oil companies and aligned with the U.S. in the Cold War.
I am deeply honored, Mr. President.
But the Shah ruled through repression, and in 1979 was overthrown in the Iranian Revolution. Iran's new supreme leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, branding the U.S. the Great Satan.
Hundreds of students occupied the embassy yesterday,
while a group of radical Islamist students seized control of the American embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage.
The White House has received assurances from the Iranian government that the American hostages are safe this morning.
For 444 days, the U.S. was consumed by the hostage crisis. The yellow ribbon at home, a symbol of those held overseas. Jimmy Carter ordered U.S. Special Forces to rescue the hostages, but the mission ended in disaster, with U.S. aircraft colliding in the desert.
To my deep regret, 8 of the crewmen of the 2 aircraft which collided were killed.
A covert effort to extract 6 U.S. diplomats did succeed and was immortalized in the Oscar-winning Ben Affleck movie Argo.
These people die. They die badly.
But the crisis helped sink Carter's presidency, and the hostages were only released minutes after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office.
The planes bearing our prisoners left Iranian airspace and are now free of Iran.
In the 1980s, the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein's Iraq during a bloody 8-year war against Iran, while Iranian-backed militants targeted the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut, killing 241 American service personnel. Since then, the U.S. has branded Iran a state sponsor of terror.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
Now, a new chapter in this complicated relationship being written in fire and smoke. Raf Sanchez, NBC News.
We want to bring in NBC's Danielle Hamamdjian. She is in nearby Lebanon. Danielle, we know every part of this region of the world is impacted by what's unfolded over the past 30 hours or so. Tell us what you are seeing and hearing.
Yeah, good evening from Beirut, Joe. Well, there are travel advisories in place for U.S. citizens across the Middle East issued by the State Department. Travel advisories warning American citizens to either stay in place, stay in shelter, as is the case in Amman. Just over an hour ago, the U.S. Embassy in Jordan, this was from the State Department, was instructing all mission personnel to continue to shelter in place and avoid the U.S. Embassy in Amman. In other places, they're asking citizens to avoid certain locations, as is the case in southeastern Turkey, which of course borders Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Here in Lebanon, over the weekend, the U.S. State Department urging all U.S. citizens to leave the country, to leave Lebanon, since there are still commercial flights operating. They're also advising citizens, especially in southern Lebanon, which of course borders Israel, those along the border with Syria, and in the suburb of Dahya, which is across the bay behind me, which is a strong Hezbollah stronghold. And so they're advising those citizens, leave now, but they're also warning them, if things do deteriorate, they are on their own. They have told them they will not be assisting in any evacuations. There are embassies and U.S. consulates on high alert all over the region. We saw riots today outside the U.S. consulate in Karachi, where several people were killed. There were also riots in Baghdad, and so on high alert here. The embassy is now been, or all services have been suspended. In terms of how vulnerable Beirut will be to Israeli strikes, well, the President Joseph Aoun said in a couple of days, yesterday in fact, that he had received assurances by the U.S. ambassador here that Israel had no intention of escalating things here so long as there was no hostile behavior by Lebanon. What, of course, they mean by that is all eyes on Hezbollah. How will Hezbollah react to this? The group, of course, is backed by Iran, has been decimated after October 7th. How will they react to this? Will they be supporting Iran's retaliation? I can tell you that as we speak, Joe, behind me in that suburb, Dahya, there are thousands of people now gathering, rallying in grief to honor Ali Khamenei. And in fact, this morning, colleagues have told us that they were woken up around 5 o'clock in the morning, not by celebratory scenes in the streets, as was the case in Iran and elsewhere around the world, but by gunfire, people learning confirmation of the news that the supreme leader had been killed. So all eyes on Hezbollah here in Lebanon. How will they react to this? How much support they will give Iran? That will dictate, I think, what or how events will unfold in Lebanon.
Danielle Hamamdjian reporting from Beirut. Danielle, thank you so much. Let's turn back now to NBC's Monica Alba at the White House. We have a couple breaking news stories over this past hour. Reports the U.S. military has sunk an Iranian warship. Also, the military saying 3 U.S. service members have been killed. We're awaiting more details about that, where it happened, whether it was all in one location. So far, Monica, the president has been perhaps surprisingly quiet today. What are we hearing from the president and his administration?
Yeah, it seems that the president is choosing his mode of communication, and for now that appears to be in the form of a couple of phone calls with various journalists. He spoke with our own Kristen Welker yesterday and talked about the initial reaction and what was going on and what the president was tracking. Today, he has been speaking with CNBC as well as Fox News, according to their journalists on the phone. And in an interview with CNBC, the president appeared to argue that he believes his own timeline here, he says, is well ahead of schedule. Now, I don't really know what that means. It's unclear exactly what he is trying to signal with that in terms of which objectives he is measuring that on a time frame basis. But remember, Joe, that in the discussion of all of this, we know that White House officials are bracing for this to be days and weeks in terms of how long this initial campaign may take. And so it's unclear what the president is trying to imply there with things being ahead of schedule. But that is the message he is putting out, at least through speaking with journalists. He's also telling Fox News that he believes that as many as multiple dozen leaders of Iran were taken out in those initial strikes. Again, that is the president's own words in an interview with Fox News, which we have not been able to verify. And it's unclear exactly how the president is basing that and what he is basing that on. So there are a couple of details that are trickling through, Joe, but the president is not coming out and giving any large address to the nation, at least so far. We know he is going to be traveling back from Florida, back from West Palm Beach later today, where he will be accompanied, as he typically is, by a group of journalists and reporters on the plane on Air Force One, where it's possible he could take questions. It's possible he could address this in that way that we typically see in a sort of back and forth fashion. But there isn't currently any speech that is planned that the White House has announced. Whether that is under discussion seems to be something that would be reasonable or logical given the mounting pressure and the many questions that Americans have about why the president decided to ultimately go forward with this, what the end game is, what the ultimate objective is. But we are learning a few more details about what contributed to the president making that ultimate call late on Friday into Saturday. And that is that the lack of progress that was seen in the diplomatic negotiations on Thursday in Geneva, where the president's own son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his special envoy, Steve Witkoff, were trying to take part in these discussions to see if some kind of a deal could be reached. There was at the time an indication of some cautious optimism that some of the talks had been positive. But what we're learning from a senior administration official is that actually the talks were a disaster from the U.S. point of view, and that they were not happy at all with the status of the negotiations. And that did seem to be a key factor in the president ultimately making that decision overnight. Joe.
Monica Alba reporting from the White House. The president expected to return there later on today. Thank you for your reporting throughout this past hour. I'm Joe Fryer in New York. That's going to do it for this hour of NBC News Now. But Hallie Jackson picks up our coverage from here right now.
I'm Hallie Jackson in Washington, and right now we are just learning that 3 U.S. service members have been killed in the operation attacking Iran. Air raid sirens blasting across the Middle East right now after the killing of Iran's supreme leader. And starting with what we're just learning about those U.S. military deaths, right now still a lot we don't know. It's not clear how or where they were killed. But the military says at least 5 other people, you're looking at the post here, were seriously hurt. This morning, some new images from the region. Take a look at some of these videos coming into us over the last few hours with this war threatening to escalate. You've got Iran now hitting the UAE, hitting Bahrain, along with Israel as well. And listen to this. You hear that? You can faintly hear it in the background, those sirens in Tel Aviv with the aftermath now. You're looking at here of a strike in a town near Jerusalem. This is where Israel says at least 9 people have been killed. And take a look at Tehran. This is new into us from just the last hour or so. Look at that. Those still images, smoke, those plumes of smoke billowing over the city there. Not clear yet if that's from an Israeli strike, but the Israelis have promised to do that in the heart of Tehran. Although Iranian state media says nearly 150 people were killed in a different strike on a girls' school in the southern part of the country. NBC News cannot independently confirm that. As Iran scrambles to figure out what's next now, after the killing of the Ayatollah, the Iranian foreign minister says a new leader may be selected in the next day or two. They've got a temporary council in place to try to figure that out. And for his part, President Trump has warned Iran not to retaliate hard today. In his words, he says, if they do, we will hit them with a force that has never been seen before, as we are hearing word of a new phone interview from President Trump with CNBC suggesting that the operation in Iran is moving along ahead of schedule. We've got our reporters fanned out across the region, a region on edge. We're going to break down the political backlash as well. But I want to start with our Pentagon correspondent, Courtney Cubie, who is live for us with more on what little we know, it sounds, Courtney, about the deaths of these U.S. service members.
Yeah, we know very little. In fact, all that we know is a statement that U.S. Central Command put out a short time ago saying that these 3 U.S. service members were killed as part of Operation Epic Fury. That's, of course, the name of this ongoing, sustained military campaign against Iran that began early Saturday morning here in the U.S., and that 5 others were seriously injured. Now, as part of that, Hallie, U.S. Central Command, that's, of course, the military command in the Middle East, says that a number of others were also suffered other injuries that included shrapnel wounds and concussions. So what that says to me is that at least some of this was due to Iranian ballistic missiles. You'll recall, after the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani several years ago during President Trump's first term in office, Iran retaliated by firing a number of ballistic missiles at al-Assad, the U.S. military base then in western Iraq. Most of the U.S. troops were able to get to shelter. They had enough of a warning, but those missiles still had a huge impact, a concussive blast that caused more than 100 men and women who were there to have a combination of concussions, some traumatic brain injuries, and other impacts that some of which weren't even felt for hours or even days until after. So to me, that's what that says. At least some of these injuries were due to. But as you mentioned, we don't know exactly when these occurred. We don't know where they occurred, if this was all one group, one incident, or if this is a roll-up of incidents throughout the region. Of course, Iran, since it began retaliating literally a short time, only a matter of a couple of hours after the U.S. and Israel began this bombing campaign in Iran, Iran has been retaliating throughout the region. We have seen hundreds of missiles and drones come from Iran, rain down throughout the region. And as President Trump himself said, they do expect that there will be casualties. Well, we're seeing the first wave of those, at least on the part of the U.S. military now, Hallie.
Court, when the president says, as he has apparently to CNBC now in a phone interview, that the operation is, in his words, well ahead of schedule, help us understand what that means, because it's been our reporting, I know, for the last 24 hours or so, that this is, we're looking at potentially weeks, not just days of attacks here.
Yeah, military officials are saying a similar thing in that it's going according to schedule, not necessarily ahead of schedule, but they aren't talking about any major setbacks so far. Again, we are very early in this campaign, and as you mentioned, Hallie, this is not a day's campaign. This is likely to be a week's campaign. The president himself laid out the objectives here, and if in fact the military is intended to be the one who brings about these objectives, that is the destruction of the Iranian nuclear program, the destruction of the Iranian ballistic missile program, the annihilation of the Iranian Navy, and then, of course, this ultimate goal of regime change brought about by a combination of the strikes from the U.S. and Israel and the Iranian people rising up, as the president called on them to do. Those are not goals that are achieved in a matter of a couple days. This is a longer, sustained campaign without some kind of a big change on the ground. I do believe that we will see this continue. And what the U.S. has forward in the region already reflects their ability to carry that out for a number of weeks.
And Court, when you look at sort of the moment that we're in, when we might find out more about the identity of these service members killed, that typically is something that will happen in a day or so from now. Injuries, the potential for more injuries as well. All of these are open questions, right?
Yeah, and you know, as far as the identities of the individuals who have been killed, the Pentagon has a policy, a longstanding policy, that they do not identify someone officially until 24 hours after all of their next of kin have been notified. So that usually is a slightly longer process. The injuries, candidly, it's just back and forth over whether they will tell us about it. And I point to the recent raid to take Nicolas Maduro and his wife into custody. You'll recall that it was days later before we were able to actually convince the Pentagon to talk to us about exactly how many people were injured and the nature of them. And we didn't even really find out about the extent of those injuries until the president's State of the Union address just this past week, almost 2 months later. And that was when we heard about some of the specific details about the pilot who was then later presented with the Medal of Honor for his actions in that raid. So, Hallie, I'm not really sure how much fidelity and detail we're going to get about these injuries, but we'll keep trying.
Courtney Kube, our national security correspondent. Court, thank you very much. Let me take you now to the region. Our Matt Bradley is there. And Matt, you are, I understand, not far outside Jerusalem in that town that we talked about that had been hit by Iran, right? Bring us a sense of what it's like on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, what you're seeing behind me, Hallie, is really, really serious destruction. Cars that have been destroyed, homes that have been completely leveled. And Hallie, this is where we've seen the highest number of casualties, 9 people dead just at this scene, nearly 30 people injured, including children and elderly people. So this is a situation that's going to be very troubling for Israelis because so far, this country has kind of managed to evade some of the worst casualties. But even more troubling to the Israeli public, what you're seeing behind me is that a lot of these casualties, according to the police, were killed while they were inside one of these safe rooms, these basically bomb shelters that are called mamads in Hebrew. Now, every building in Israel has a mamad ever since the 1980s. That's part of the law here. But this one seemed like it took a direct hit. But the police are investigating as to why this particular safe room wasn't able to endure this ballistic missile, which also had managed to evade Israel's formidable air defense systems. So for most Israelis, the mamads have been very safe. There have been very few casualties. But the fact is that while these safe rooms, and this one here was under a synagogue, these safe rooms are able to endure the concussive blast of a ballistic missile strike, they can't really take a direct hit. So for a lot of Israelis who have been relying on these places, like me, this is going to be a very troubling scene, not just because of the large number of people who have been killed here, far more than any other single incident we've seen since these attacks began with Israel's strikes on Iran with American help on Saturday morning.
Matt Bradley, live for us in Israel. I know that you are in the thick of it, Matt. Obviously, we're going to come back to you when we can. I've got to get to Monica Alba back here at the White House because, Monica, in the last maybe 8 minutes or so, we have seen, I would call it a flurry of comments from President Trump through media outlets who may be calling him, reaching out to him. Clearly, he's on the phone this morning. Clearly, he is talking with reporters because we've got several. CNBC, Fox, I think The Atlantic just dropped as well. And the president's making some news here. Fill us in.
Yeah, Hallie, exactly. And yesterday we did see the president engage with some reporters and anchors on the phone, but today he does seem to be choosing that as his mode of communication and trying to get a little bit of his message out. We did see a little bit overnight on True Social where he did issue another warning to Iran, and now he is doing that through the course of a couple of these interviews. I will start with The Atlantic that you just mentioned that we're just getting details on, where the president is arguing and claiming, he says, that he believes that some Iranian officials, quote, want to talk, and I have agreed to talk, so I will be talking to them. He says they should have done it sooner. They should have given what was very practical and easy to do sooner. They waited too long, seemingly referencing the status of the diplomatic negotiations and the ongoing talks that his own son-in-law and special envoy were a part of over the course of the last many weeks to see if this military action could potentially be avoided. Obviously, the president decided to go forward with that, but is now saying he may resume these conversations. It is unclear who he means he will be speaking with, and he seems to acknowledge that, saying he couldn't indicate when this conversation might happen. And he noted, according to The Atlantic, that some of the Iranians involved in negotiations in recent weeks were no longer alive. He told The Atlantic, most of those people are gone. Some of the people we were dealing with are gone because that was a big, big hit, and they should have done it sooner. They could have made a deal. So a couple of things from that, Hallie, that obviously stand out, because we know that there had been this sort of dual track preparation where there was all of the ongoing behind the scenes briefing, meticulous planning for months about this menu of options that the president was presented with for what he could do with military action, while he had these top aides and advisors engaged on the potential diplomatic negotiations aspect. We know both of those things were running at the same time. There was this question once the strikes happened, what would happen? Could there be a return to some diplomatic conversation? The president claiming he's going to be involved in that. We will see exactly how that goes and how that is going to actually develop. We know that there are supposed to be technical talks next week in Vienna for some of the negotiations, and we know that the foreign minister of Oman, who had been a key intermediary and mediator there, indicated that he would be a part of those technical talks. But it was unclear up until this point whether the United States would be a part of that. And again, it's a little bit unclear even now what the president means. So that is one interview the president did this morning. He also indicated to CNBC he's arguing that his plan here is, quote, ahead of schedule and moving very, very rapidly. Now, we also don't know what that means in terms of the context of what would be ahead of schedule, behind schedule, or right on target. But the president indicated in another interview to Fox News that as many, he argues, the president, as many as 48 leaders of Iran, he says, have been taken out, have been killed with this joint U.S. and Israeli action over the last 36 hours or so. It's unclear exactly what he is basing that assessment on, what intelligence, whether that is shared intelligence or whether that is a U.S. assessment at this point. But he is saying essentially that so much of the leadership has been decimated that maybe that is perhaps why he is arguing that things are running ahead of schedule. So that is just what has come out in the last hour or so. Hallie, the president, for his part, is traveling, we expect, back from Florida later today to the White House, to Washington, where we hope he will engage with reporters aboard Air Force One to answer some really pressing questions that we still don't know the answers to about this ongoing massive operation. Hallie.
Monica Alba posted up there on the North Lawn for us. Mon, thank you. I'll ask you to stand by, but I want to get back to the region. Keir Simmons is in Dubai because Keir, we mentioned, as we're talking about all of the things that have happened in really the last maybe 30 minutes to the last couple of hours, the response from Washington. Let's talk about what's happening in the region, and Iran appearing to widen these strikes, right, to other Gulf states, other countries in the region here. Talk about this, because some experts question, what is the strategy here? There's some question of whether this could backfire on Iran.
Yeah, well, it is backfiring on Iran in one sense that the Arab world, the Gulf, here where I am, those leaders are furious with Iran. Even Oman, as you mentioned, which was mediating last week between between Iran and America, and even criticized the strikes, it now has been struck by the Iranians. So to your point, whether there's a strategy, Ayatollah Khamenei has been killed. So I mean, whose finger is on the trigger in Iran? That's a worry. Really, I mean, there has been a bombardment here, Hallie. Honestly, it's been this morning, 2 strikes this morning, loud, one louder than the other. There were vibrations. I'll just reassure people. I say this every time we do a live shot, but people, I think it's important to tell people that my family is sheltering in place in our house, which is right here, and I'm undercover because one of the things that's happening is that a lot of these munitions are getting shot out of the sky, but the debris falls, and if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, bad luck. So, we are being careful because effectively Iran has turned this whole region into a war zone. Back to your question about the strategy. Look, the strategy ostensibly may be to try to get these governments to go to Washington and say, stop this. And that may happen because, events are spiraling and we don't know what could happen tomorrow. So that can happen. There are a number of people who have died here in the UAE and in other countries. 500 drones been fired here, according to the UAE, 170, almost 170 missiles, and that's just this country. So escalate things, escalate things, escalate things. That's what the Iranian strategy is, if there is one.
So when you talk about the threat level here, I mean, in the region, it is high. When you talk about the potential for some kind of an off-ramp here, to your point, Iran isn't really doing much to try to convince some of these other Gulf nations to help them out.
Iran doesn't want an off-ramp, Hallie, because here's why. The Iranian regime thinks it is facing an existential threat, a threat to its very existence, and it prefers to, if you like, thump its chest and show resistance than to, in its eyes, capitulate to America. That effectively would make it weak and potentially it wouldn't last in the eyes of the regime. Although, of course, many of these regime leaders are now gone. But there are others, there and coming up. Again, another point to make about the Iranian regime, it is sprawling. It is a network. It's almost like a communist, bureaucracy across the country. And so that's what you're dealing with, although it may be that Israel and the US are talking to people there, and already as we speak, they may be figuring out how to get to some kind of compromise. Look, I mean, if President Trump's decision changes Iran and changes this region for the better, then extraordinary. But there are so many risks, and that's the other piece that we can't help but focus on. And the risks are really about, just as another example, does Saudi Arabia, the UAE, who are now saying we reserve the right to retaliate, do they get involved in this? President Putin criticizing the strikes. Russia is a long-time partner with a strategic alliance with Iran, or at least the Iran that was. So what happens there? I mean, there are lots and lots of moving parts here, and the conversations you were just having before you cut to me, what President Trump and the Trump administration is trying to do is control, dominate the escalation, control the situation. But there are lots of ways in which this is and can be slipping out of their control. Another example of that, while I'm with you, just to say, the Strait of Hormuz, which is where 20% of the world's oil and gas passes. Now, that's closed. The Iranians say they've closed it. It's closed anyway because, as you know, from other events that we've seen in recent years, when shipping insurance companies think there's a risk, they just say stop. So companies are just saying stop, stop, stop. That's going to have an impact on the price of oil. And I don't see how that strait gets reopened until this war is over. And I don't know when this war is over.
And then can I ask you, Keir, when the president says they want to talk and I've agreed to talk, who is he talking to? Do we have any idea as Iran is sorting through some of these questions around who takes over now?
I don't know. It's very likely that there is bitter rivalry within the Iranian, landscape over who gets to take over. So I don't know. I mean, I'm sure they're having private conversations, but let's just make a point. Let's just make another point here, which is that the Trump administration spent a good deal of time talking with the Iranians in recent weeks, ultimately to find that the Iranians were just talking to them for time. And the Obama administration talked to the Iranians and did a deal that ultimately this region hated because it only focused on the nuclear issue, not the ballistic missiles that are now being fired at these countries. So the Iranians are amazing at talking. They're the world leaders in talking. But, what are they talking about? And where's it going to get to? And who's really in charge over there? And is there a scenario where the country is in chaos, and that's the story in Iran? Quite simply, that's the story. And I'll just go back. Let's just go back to the Strait of Hormuz for a second and just make a point about that. The question of if Iran ends up in chaos, we're not there yet, but if it does, just think about over in Yemen, the Houthis, who massively changed shipping in the Red Sea, and they are a ragtag bunch who just threw a few missiles. A chaotic Iran with different groups. That doesn't make for a happy reopening of a crucial shipping lane for oil and gas.
Keir Simmons, Keir, we're glad to have you with us. We appreciate your context, your analysis. You've covered this region for many, many years. Thank you. I know you're staying close to a camera, too. I want to go to Meet the Press moderator now, Kristen Welker, who's just been having conversations with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle here, Kristen. All of this, as we have heard from the president, you spoke with him, I know, less than 24 hours ago. Sounds like he's doing another round of phone calls this morning. Give us the sense of the landscape from Washington here. From Democrats, it sounds largely like criticism of what they have described as a quote-unquote war of choice. From Republicans, support for the president, especially from, of course, Senator Lindsey Graham.
Yes, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of President Trump's top allies, of course, was insistent this morning that this action will ultimately make Iran, that region, and the United States safer. Quickly to my phone conversation with President Trump on Saturday, Hallie, the big takeaway there, in addition to saying that the Iranian leader had been killed, the supreme leader, he also said that a number of its leadership structure had been taken out. And now we are learning, of course, from Israel that some 40 military commanders were killed. Again, that is according to Israel. We heard Senator Lindsey Graham with a full-throated support of this military operation, Hallie. But a number of key questions remain. You've been discussing them throughout the hour so far. What are the next steps? What's the strategy moving forward? What's the off-ramp look like? And does the president rule out putting U.S. boots on the ground? I pressed Senator Lindsey Graham on that. Take a look at part of that exchange. Does the president have a plan to guarantee that that happens?
No, it's not his job or my job to do this. How many times do I have to tell you?
Our job is to make sure Iran is no longer the largest state sponsor of terrorism, to help the people reconstruct a new government, no boots on the ground. We don't own, you know, this idea you break it, you own it. I don't buy that one bit.
So that was a very notable admission there, Hallie, by Senator Lindsey Graham, saying that he doesn't subscribe to that idea that if you break it, you own it. Of course, that was an idea that was put forth after the Iraq War. Again, though, what you didn't hear in that answer, what is the strategy moving forward? His argument is it's up to the Iranian people to replace its leadership, that they need to take the lead on that. Is that realistic without putting U.S. boots on the ground? Again, he insists it is. He insists it is possible. But, Hallie, I think that's part of where the focus is going to be this week. As you know, the administration's going to be briefing more members of Congress. They, of course, did brief the Gang of Eight before these strikes. They're going to be holding more briefings, frankly, in the coming hours and in the coming days. And that's where the pressure is going to come from for these answers, Hallie.
And how about, Kristen, a direct message from the president to the American people at this point? Obviously, we heard from him in that online post, when this was all unfolding in the early morning hours of what it was yesterday, now Saturday morning, Kristen. He is in Mar-a-Lago. He's heading back today. Our Monica Alba has suggested, and again, we don't know, but he sometimes talks on Air Force One on his way back to Washington. Are you getting any sense from the folks that you're talking to that there needs to be more of a presence from the president to explain to Americans, now that we have service members who have been killed in this operation, the rationale here, which he addressed briefly at the State of the Union, but really only glancingly?
So that's a great question. I think that Monica's absolutely right. I would be surprised, Hallie, if we didn't hear from him in some form or capacity today. I think talking to reporters who are traveling with him certainly makes sense. The fact that he's holding this outreach with folks who are calling him this morning is a piece of that. But does there need to be a more formal discussion, address, presentation to the American people? Those are the types of discussions that are underway at the White House behind the scenes. How should President Trump address this with the American people? And I can tell you that a number of his allies are insistent, Hallie. He's got to make his case to the American people. He's got to explain what happens now that the Iranian leadership has been removed. You heard him touch on that during that videotaped message from Mar-a-Lago on Saturday, where he said that this is the best chance the Iranian people may ever have to bring about fulsome regime change, a different direction for their country. But what does that actually look like, and how will that be implemented? Those are the questions he has not answered. He's talked about off-ramps, but hasn't given specific details for how that would be carried out. So, Hallie, I think what's going to happen at the White House over the next few days is a robust discussion about how and when the president sells this to the American people.
Kristen Welker, our moderator of Meet the Press. Kristen, thank you very much. We'll look for more from you, I know, throughout the day here on NBC News. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Hallie.
I want to bring in now NBC News military analyst Colonel Steve Warren. Colonel, glad to have you with us. Thank you for being here. As you now know, we have, in the last maybe hour, I want to say, 90 minutes, confirmed that there have been U.S. casualties. These 3 U.S. service members who were killed in this operation. We know several others have been hurt. And obviously questions of what continues to unfold as the U.S. has telegraphed that this is an operation that is going to last not a matter of days, but weeks, essentially. Talk us through the calculus of this operation here in your mind.
Sure, Hallie. Unfortunate, tragic that we've lost 3 service members, another possibly 5 or half a dozen wounded. We have to be prepared for this to continue. This is a war. We have a saying in the military, the enemy gets a vote. So they will punch back as best they can. We've also received some more positive news. One of the president's objectives is to destroy the Iranian Navy. We've sunk the first Iranian ship. Long way to go, though. They have probably 24 combatant surface combat ships, maybe another 24 submarines. So a lot of work to be done there. We also know that we've struck several multiple missile sites, missile radars, launch capability, and potentially even some missile storage capability. So this operation is progressing very steadily. What we're in now, I think we in the military, we use a phrase called battle rhythm. So this is a rhythm of we understand what the objectives are, we understand what the targets are. We'll now surveil the targets, strike the targets, observe the amount of damage that we did to those targets, and then determine if those targets need to be reattacked or if we can move on to the next set of targets.
How about this idea of the potential of U.S. boots on the ground there?
Yeah, I think that's a stretch. We have not seen a buildup of combat forces in the region. Historically, when we have conducted other large-scale operations, it's a weeks, if not months-long generation of combat power locally. So to project the number of forces that would be needed all the way to Iran, from the United States shores, that would be quite a stretch. Now, that doesn't rule out, Hallie, the possibility of certain targeted, highly specialized special forces operations missions in Iran. I don't think we can rule those out, as we saw, for example, in Venezuela 2 months ago. But I think that's probably all we'll see.
Can you also talk, too, about the intelligence that goes into an operation like this, considering the targets here, including, obviously, the Ayatollah, including these other notables in the Iranian leadership, as President Trump has suggested that potentially dozens of people in the Iranian leadership have been essentially taken out in this operation?
Sure. Two pieces to that intelligence picture, Hallie. The first piece, I'll start with the conventional targets that we just finished talking about, these missile launchers, industrial sites, et cetera. Keep in mind, the United States of America has been observing, watching, analyzing, studying Iran for years and years and years, for decades, frankly. So we understand where those launchers are, where the production sites are, where the hide sites are. We know where all of that is because we've been looking at it for decades. Everything from satellites to drones to human intelligence to open source intelligence, we've been watching closely. On the leadership side, I would say this is a result of a much more focused effort, probably in the last several months, working closely with allies and partners in the region to really determine how these individuals live. In other words, what's important is to understand what time do they go to work. What time do they go to work in the morning? How do they get there? What routes do they take? This sort of broad pattern of life observation so that we can understand where they're going to be and when they're going to be there. Two different things, both so far proving very successful, Hallie.
And then when it comes to the response from the Iranians on the ground here, when you look at this from putting your military analyst hat on, when you look at it from the expertise that you have in the region here, how do you see that unfolding in the days to come?
Well, so far, their response has been, I think, fairly significant. It's been an intense response. There's been a lot of discussion about the Iranian decision to strike, Arab nations in the region, the Gulf nations, the calculus that they used, and we've talked quite a bit about the assessment is that they are trying to pressure Gulf nations to in turn pressure America. That does not yet appear to be working. We'll see if it does. We also know there's something that we use, a term that we use in the military called missile math, right? We understand how many missiles do they have, how many launchers do they have, how many radars do they have, how much of those things have we destroyed. So we're keeping a very close tally of how many missiles they have remaining in their inventory, how many more launchers do they have. If you think of this as a boxing match, we're probably in the second round here. One fighter is starting to get a little bit tired. The other one is remaining strong.
Colonel Steve Warren, our NBC News military analyst. Colonel, thank you very much for being with us. We are glad to have you and your expertise, and I know you're staying close to a camera. Appreciate that. We've got a lot more to come in our special report here on NBC News Now, our rolling coverage of the operation in Iran. We're going to take you back to the region. We're going to take you to the Beirut with how things are unfolding there. Plus, we've got our analysis from teams here in Washington and beyond. Stay with us. We're going to sneak in this quick break. We'll be right back. We are back with our continuing coverage of that operation striking Iran. We are now just about 36 hours in. We have heard from President Trump already this morning, talking with various news outlets. We've also heard from CENTCOM confirming that 3 U.S. service members have been killed in this operation. Several more, at least 5, have also been hurt. No further details yet on when, where, or how any of that happened, but it is coming as obviously this is a region that is facing a series of attacks. Iran has now escalated its strikes to other Gulf nations. We have seen the president vow to take action against Iran if they were to retaliate even harder. Want to take you now to Beirut. NBC News international correspondent Danielle Hamamdjian is there in southern Lebanon, of course. Give us a sense of what you're seeing on the ground, Danielle.
Hey, Hallie, where I'm in Beirut, and behind me is a bay, but across the bay is the southern suburb of Dahya, which is a Hezbollah stronghold. Hezbollah, of course, backed by Iran, but also a group that has been decimated following months of war with Israel after October 7th. In the past couple of hours, thousands of people gathered in Dahya to honor Khamenei. And this morning, in fact, colleagues telling us that they were woken up around 5 a.m. by gunfire after it was confirmed by Iranian authorities that he had, in fact, been killed. In Lebanon, well, first of all, there are travel advisories all over the Middle East, as you know, Hallie, for U.S. citizens to shelter, to avoid certain places to travel to. Southeastern Turkey, for example, which borders Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Here in Lebanon, the U.S. State Department over the weekend urging U.S. citizens to leave the country while commercial flights are still operating. Not all of them, but some of them are. Also urging U.S. citizens who are in Dahya, that southern suburb, or in southern Lebanon, which borders Israel, to get out. And if the warning came, if things do deteriorate, you are on your own. Do not count on the U.S. government for evacuations. Now, will Beirut be vulnerable to strikes or attacks by Israel? Good question. But according to the president here, Joseph Aoun, who said earlier that he had received assurances by the U.S. ambassador here that Israel did not plan on escalating things here so long as there was no hostile actions or behavior coming from Lebanon. What do they mean by that, of course, is Hezbollah. How is Hezbollah going to handle, or how much support will they be showing or giving Iran as it retaliates against Israel and the United States? There was a statement by Naim Qassem, who is the leader of Hezbollah, who said, of course, he offered his condolences, but said on the assassination of Khamenei that we will fulfill our duty in confronting the aggression and we will not abandon the field of resistance, no matter the sacrifices. Things that he has said over and over again. So nothing here particularly stands out. But again, all eyes on Hezbollah and how they are going to show or not show support for Iran as it retaliates. Hallie.
Well, you look at Hezbollah, you look at Russia, too, obviously. And what are we hearing from the Kremlin, if anything?
Yeah, this statement from the Kremlin, which I'll read to you, the foreign affairs there. Washington and Tel Aviv have once again embarked on a perilous course that is swiftly pushing the region toward a humanitarian, economic, and potentially even radiological disaster. Now, Russia, of course, has depended in the past on Iran for its drone supply, drones that it uses in its war in Ukraine, and now has that technology to make the drones itself. But this also poses a question of how is Russia going to handle now all the attention on Iran? And does Donald Trump take his eye off the Ukraine war? Don't forget that there were peace talks in Geneva this week. Alongside the talks on Iran, there were talks on Ukraine. Does this now, with Iran, all over the headlines, all over the conversation now, does this leave the door even more open for Vladimir Putin to prosecute this war in Ukraine even more aggressively?
Danielle Hamamdjian, live for us there in the region in Beirut. Danielle, thank you very much for your reporting and for being there. We'll be coming back to you throughout the day here on NBC as we get more. Thank you so much. Let's take it to Iran now with what's happening inside that country after the death of the Ayatollah, President Trump, telling Iranians to try to take the moment, seize the moment, take over the government. But the Iranian foreign minister has told NBC News just about 18 hours ago that regime change would be, in their words, mission impossible here. So you have this leadership gap, at least at the moment, although there is activity this morning, today, in and around Iran about this council to try to figure out who takes the reins moving forward. I want to bring in former CIA analyst and vice president of policy at the Middle East Institute, Kenneth Pollack. Ken, thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure, Hallie.
So let's talk through some of this. President Trump told The Atlantic just this morning, and I'm looking at my notes here, and just maybe the last, 45 minutes, not even, that he said they want to talk, and I've agreed to talk, so I will be talking to them. He says they should have done it sooner. They should have given what was very practical and easy to do sooner. They waited too long. Not to state the obvious, talks had been going on not 4 days ago, right, with Iran. The president was not pleased with how those talks were going. Flash forward to Friday night, Saturday morning, you've seen what's unfolded. But if there were to be further talks with Iran, who would he even be talking with? In other words, who is stepping into this leadership gap?
Well, first, Hallie, we know that the Iranians have been preparing for gaps in their leadership, at least since the 12-day war. Right. At that point in time, they lost significant leaders. And we know afterwards that Ayatollah Khamenei designated successors down 4 levels. So first guy gets killed, next guy stands up. They did it down 4 different levels. And by the way, I apologize for using male, but these are all going to be men. So just make it easier. Ultimately, what that suggests is that there's going to be continuity in terms of this regime. As long as the regime remains intact and in control in Tehran, I think that we can assume that there is a leadership in place that is capable of making decisions. Now, they've probably been somewhat shocked. I think that the best evidence we have is that the regime was expecting that the U.S. would hit them, but that the strikes would probably be more focused on their nuclear program, ballistic missiles, maybe the military, that it wouldn't necessarily be about regime change. And what we've seen in terms of Iranian responses militarily, I think back that up. What we saw yesterday seems to have been a set of pre-planned Iranian responses to a set of attacks that they thought would really just target, again, their ballistic missiles, nuclear, the stuff that President Trump was negotiating with them about. I do think that they've been a little bit wrong-footed by the fact that the U.S. now seems to be pursuing regime change instead. But again, right now, they do seem to be coherent. Ali Larijani, the former Speaker of the Iranian parliament, is now leading the government. There do seem to be people in place. So I do think that they're capable of making coherent decisions. What they'll actually decide to negotiate on is something else.
Say more about this, right? Because obviously any replacement to the Ayatollah would need to be a high-ranking, cleric. You talk about somebody like Larijani, who is, former IRGC, kind of the security head of Iran, who's been largely doing this, can we say the nuts and bolts day-to-day work of leadership in Iran? What is the interplay there, and how much influence does somebody like him have moving forward, given what's happened?
Sure. So first, Hallie, got to start with a disclaimer. The Iranian regime is incredibly opaque, and it works in utterly Byzantine ways. So we have to be very careful about how much we speculate right now. Sure. That said, you're absolutely right. Ali Larijani is the ultimate Iranian technocrat. He's a conservative, probably a hardliner, but he's not a crazy. He's someone that Khamenei has, as you put it, more or less designated the running of the day-to-day government too. So right now they've got continuity in that sense. What you never know behind the scenes, but I think that we can all assume is going on because it is the norm in Tehran, is that there is a tremendous amount of backroom politics going on. The Revolutionary Guard is the most important institution in Iran by far. They've obviously suffered some losses in recent days as well, but as an institution, their interests are very clear. And Larijani is almost certainly going to have to be taking a great deal of caution not to get crosswise with them. He may very well be taking his orders from the Revolutionary Guard. And of course, that's always been a real concern with the idea of removing Ayatollah Khamenei, because Ayatollah Khamenei, right, horrible person, nasty dictator, anti-American, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic, you name it, but ultimately someone who was actually very, very cautious, ultimately very prudent. Larijani typically is too. The Guard leadership often is not. They tend to be far more aggressive, far more anti-American, far more willing to take risks. And I think this is the real question mark out there, is how much is policy in Iran really being driven by the Guard leadership behind the scenes? How much by somebody like Larijani, as I said, a somewhat more conservative technocrat in front of things?
Ken, it's just so interesting, and I think it's important to talk about. And to your point, obviously extremely opaque, but going to be critical for the next steps for the U.S. moving forward. With your intelligence background here, give us a sense of how you see the region at the moment, given Iran escalating and widening where it's attacking some of these other Gulf nations. We had Keir Simmons on earlier, and he made, I think, a good point about the question around strategy that I know some experts have, and that it doesn't appear that Iran maybe has much of one at the moment. What's your assessment?
Sure. So I think that I'll put it this way. Everything that I'm hearing from friends in the Gulf, from the region is very tense. I mean, in some ways, that's a bit of understatement there. There's a lot of concern. I mean, look, the vast majority of countries in the region, certainly their leaderships, they hate the Iranians. They would love to see the Islamic Republic gone. But, right, and this is a huge but, they don't know both what Iran has in store, as you pointed out, or what the United States has in store. And honestly, Hallie, that's a much bigger concern for them right now. They assume that the Iranians are going to lash out. They assume that the Iranians are going to try to cause as much pain as they possibly can. I think that we've certainly seen the tip of the iceberg on that. And of course, going forward, as I said, what we saw was probably a bunch of pre-scripted Iranian operations. The question now is, as the Iranians are starting to improvise, what are they going to try to do? And of course, what capabilities will they be left with? But just as important for them, as in fact, much more important for them, is what is the United States planning? They want the Iranian regime gone. Their nightmare is that the United States blows up a bunch of stuff, riles up the Iranians, and then walks away, leaving this regime in place, or brings it down and then walks away, leaving it in chaos. Both of those scenarios are incredibly dangerous and incredibly frightening for all of our allies in the region.
Ken, we're so glad to have you and your expertise. I know you'll be coming back with us as we continue to monitor developments and bring them to you from around the world throughout the day here on NBC. Thank you. We're also monitoring what's happening here in the United States with this big demonstration supporting freedom in Iran, expected to kick off in less than an hour up in New York. They're going to begin at the United Nations and then march over to Times Square, where protesters against U.S. involvement have already been. We saw that over the course of the day on Saturday. I want to bring in Valerie Castro, who is there now. She is in New York. It hasn't begun just yet, Valerie, but expected to not long from now.
That's right, Hallie. In about an hour from now, as you mentioned, that group is expected to kick off from the UN and make their way here to Times Square. It is a Stand with the People of Iran march organized by local Iranians here in New York City. And this follows protests from yesterday that we saw come together after a coalition of grassroots organizations called for emergency protests, not just here in New York City, but in cities across the country, places like Washington, D.C. They were there outside the White House and also in Los Angeles, calling for the U.S. to stay out of Iran, to not get involved with the conflict in Iran. Here in New York, it was a relatively peaceful protest. The marchers eventually made their way around the city, shutting down some area streets, but again, mostly peaceful. But again, marches planned again for today. Hallie.
And what else have you seen? I know that you were out in the protest, the protest against U.S. action in Iran yesterday, right? That was also part of this.
Yeah, Hallie, and keep in mind, with all of these protests, there's also the concern of any retaliation here on U.S. soil. So we have seen a stepped-up law enforcement presence here in New York City, as you will see in other cities around the country. We know there are currently no known threats that U.S. counterterrorism officials are tracking, but they are on high alert. Here in New York, we saw the NYPD step up a visible presence outside Temple Emmanuel, a large synagogue on the Upper East Side here in Manhattan. They have been outside the Israeli consulate, outside the Iranian mission to the UN. Again, currently tracking no known threats, but certainly on alert for any potential activity like that. Hallie.
Valerie Castro, live for us there in New York. Valerie, thank you very much. Much more to get to here in our special coverage, including the economic fallout now from that operation in the Middle East, how it could affect gas prices when we pick back up right after this quick break. Welcome back to our breaking news coverage of the U.S. strikes on Iran. And a question now. We've been talking about the impact in the region, the impact here at home, the protests we expect to see today, the questions over Iranian leadership. Here's another question. Oil prices. What happens to those? Expected to rise today now as the fighting continues, and Iran escalating its attacks in the region, too. You heard Keir Simmons earlier in this discussion talk about the Strait of Hormuz. Huge. This is a huge global shipping route for oil. It is a big deal. It is, as you can see, geographically right in the thick of where everything is happening. I want to bring in NBC News business and economy reporter Ali Canal. So talk us through it. Let's start with oil prices. Trading picks up later today. Expectation is a potential spike, right?
Yeah, analysts tell me oil prices are likely to rise when markets reopen at 6 p.m. Eastern tonight. Now, crude could jump anywhere from a few dollars a gallon to as much as 15 to 20 bucks a barrel here. Now, that would push oil back to that $80 to $90 range. We haven't seen sustained levels like that in quite some time. Now, economists this morning were also urging caution, noting that global oil production today is significantly higher than it was 2 decades ago. There are roughly 90 million barrels currently floating on tankers worldwide. That can act as a sort of buffer here. So it's very possible that we will see volatility, but history shows that these spikes often moderate once we see shipping resume. Of course, that is a big question when it comes to the timing, and it's something that markets will be closely watching in the days and weeks ahead here.
So then talk through the gas price impact, right? And what that means is the trickle-down effect.
Yeah, I mean, crude prices very closely correlated with the price of gas, and we could see that flow through very quickly. Typically, every $1 move in the price of crude, that translates to roughly 2 to 3 cents a gallon for gas. So an increase of 15 to 20 bucks in oil, that can mean gas prices rise anywhere from 30 to 60 cents a gallon. And that's on top of some of those normal increases that we typically see around this time. We have more drivers on the road. We do have those refineries switching to more expensive summer blends. So this could really hit consumers all at the same time here. And if we take a step back, Iran only contributes about 3 to 4% of global oil production. So that direct impact is somewhat contained. But you mentioned the Strait of Hormuz. That's really the critical question here. It sits right along the southern coast of Iran. You're seeing that map now, a very narrow passageway. That's what analysts and experts are really focused on. Any disruptions there, that's going to contribute further to sustained increases in oil and therefore the prices that you pay at the pump.
Pull back out just a little bit, too, here, Allie, before I let you go. It's not just oil. This is a critical cargo route as well. We've seen 2 of the world's biggest shippers say they're going to suspend operations for obvious reasons here for at least a little bit. What kind of a timeline on an impact there? What kind of impact does that have for shipments that are going to other parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing some of that impact as you just laid out here. I mean, huge disruptions here. They're going to have to change up their routes, possibly go around the Cape of Good Hope. That's off the coast of South Africa. Now, that's going to add weeks of delays. It's going to drive up production costs, create port congestions, drive up shipping costs, and that puts a lot of pressure on global supply chains. We are still dealing with some of the effects of the shocks that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is very critical here. And if we see some of that sustained pressure, that's likely going to lead to slower economic growth across the globe at a time when inflation remains elevated. So that's the key economic question here moving forward.
Allie Canal. Allie, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Let me go back to now Monica Alba, who's at the White House now. And Monica, before we go to you, I want to get to some breaking news that is coming into us here at our team right now. I'm just going to check with my team to make sure this is reportable. And I believe that it is here. That we understand, we're learning just a little bit more here, Mon, about the attack on those 3 U.S. service members, or the attack that killed, I should say, those three U.S. service members, hurt several others. It apparently occurred in Kuwait, according to 2 U.S. officials. This is coming into us from our Pentagon team, reporting this out. The troops are part of an Army sustainment unit that's based in Kuwait. So this is answering, Monica, at least a degree of some of the questions that we'd had about the circumstances surrounding the deaths of these troops. The injury of these troops. And for President Trump, Monica, it highlights, I think, this commander-in-chief moment that any president steps into when they plan and execute over a period of many, many months, as our reporting bears out, an operation like this.
And one, Hallie, that the president acknowledged in that overnight video that he posted once this operation began. It was actually a portion of those remarks that really stood out because he did seem to be warning that American lives could be lost in an undertaking, in a massive operation like this one. And that is when he used the term war. He said that when you do something like this, something that is war, you could see American heroes have to basically pay the ultimate price. So that is something he did include and lay out as an expectation when he was making his case and really revealing some of the initial objectives here and the initial arguments for why he decided to pursue this military action with Israel. But now, as you point out, Hallie, there are more persistent and urgent questions about how drawn out this is going to be, how long this is going to take, and how many more American lives and U.S. service members may be put in harm's way and could be killed and could be gravely injured as a result of this. And that is why you are seeing a little bit of this building pressure on the White House and on the president to make a larger speech potentially at some point to the American people that could go into some of that detail. For now, we haven't seen any indication that the president is going to do that today, at least. We know he will be traveling back later in the coming hours from Florida to Washington, D.C., where he will face those kinds of questions from reporters if he chooses to engage on them. But that is certainly the larger aspect to all of this, and the really tragic one, and one that the president has indicated could be even more likely as this is drawn out. We do know he has indicated to reporters that he is arguing this is ahead of schedule. Unclear exactly what that means in the time frame and the timeline that the Trump administration envisions. But we are understanding that for now, we shouldn't be considering this in just days. This is likely a weeks-long campaign that will potentially provoke further retaliation on some of these U.S. bases, some of these military assets in the region, including in Kuwait, as you just mentioned, which is the site of where these 3 U.S. service members were killed and additional U.S. service members were seriously injured. Hallie.
Monica Alba live for us on the North Lawn. Mon, thank you. I want to bring in Elise Labott now, the author of Cosmopolitics on Substack. Elise, it's good to see you. We were just getting word, this is from an Iranian news agency, but a statement by a rep of the Defense Council here, that the Ayatollah Khamenei did not bow to repeated aggressions by the enemy, framing the Ayatollah who was killed in this operation as a martyr here, and also adding that forecasts and decisions for what's happening now have been made, meaning the chain of command has been briefed and is prepared to continue the battle. And I think, Elise, that gives you a sense that Iran is not willing and certainly doesn't seem like it is going to imminently at all back down from its aggression in the region.
That's right, Hallie. And based on that phrasing, you kind of got to wonder if the Iranians knew, well, they knew that something could be coming, that war would be coming. And as far back as June during the 12-day war, you know that the supreme leader, look, he was 86 years old, he was sick, and he was thinking about succession. And if he knew that he was at the end of his life and he saw what was happening over the last few months, the disaffection by the people out in the streets, you got to wonder if he said he was in his office, Hallie, when these strikes went down. You got to wonder, did he want to be a martyr? Did he go out? Did they set anything in motion? I'm not saying it did happen, but these are questions that you have to ask. And when President Trump says, you know, I've talked to them, they want to talk, I don't think you're really going to see a different attitude towards the Iranian regime. Well, this is a regime that, in addition to its survival, their whole raison d'etre is defiance against the great state in the United States.
And I think it's important when you talk about these talks, and you know what the president said to The Atlantic earlier today. A senior Trump administration official tells our team that the Iranian foreign minister had in the conversations last week now with officials had insisted on what he described as the inalienable right. I'm reading this here because I want to get it right. The inalienable right to enrich uranium at that meeting with Steve Witkoff, with Jared Kushner, et cetera. So if that is the position of the Iranian regime, how do you even move talks forward, to your point, Elise?
Well, and also, I have to say, and we haven't talked much about this over the span of these talks with the Iranians, but the messaging out of these talks was all over the place. The president was saying no enrichment. Steve Witkoff was saying, well, maybe some enrichment for medical purposes, or like, you know, a pinprick amount of enrichment so that they can say that for medical purposes or something, they can say that they enrich. Those two, one of those things is not true. And so were these talks either on the Iranian side or on the U.S. side, I mean, really serious? As much as the U.S. says that the Iranians weren't serious about these talks, I don't know beyond full surrender whether the U.S. was very serious about these talks. Going forward, you really need to think if the Iranians are going to talk. And Hallie, Monica was saying, we've been talking about, this is a war. The Iranians have made this, now that the U.S. and Israel struck, It's not just a war with Israel and the United States. This is the war in the region. They've struck out against all of the Arab allies. You know, these Arab allies did not want this war, and they could have driven a wedge between those allies in the United States after they went ahead. But I think now you need negotiators that are able to sit down and understand and talk with the Iranians.
Elise, we're glad to have you. Thank you. And thank you all, as always, for watching. We will have much more special coverage right here on NBC News Now. I'm Hallie Jackson in Washington. I'll see you later on tonight on Nightly News as well. Take care.